Below is a list of 10 countries with the most satellites in Earth orbit today. Can you guess the top name? According to Orbiting Now, a website specializing in tracking and monitoring the activities of satellites in orbit, as of March 7, there were 9,585 active satellites in Earth's orbit, of which about 72% are satellites. Small satellites are satellites with a smaller weight and size than traditional satellites, with a maximum mass of only about 1.2 tons. In the 1990s, only 34% of satellites launched into Earth orbit were small satellites, but by the 2020s, this number increased to 94%, showing the trend of small satellites being used more and more commonly globally, thanks to its advantages. In particular, small satellites mainly operate in low Earth orbit, LEO low Earth orbit, while large satellites mainly operate in geostationary orbit, GEO geosynchronous Earth orbit. Specifically, about 12% of satellites are operating in geostationary orbit, 84% of satellites are operating in low Earth orbit, and only 3% of satellites are operating in medium Earth orbit, MEO medium Earth orbit. 1% of satellites are operating in higher orbits. This is because low Earth orbit is more accessible and has certain advantages for small satellites, such as faster signal transmission speeds, so satellites operate on LEO are primarily satellites that provide telecommunications and communication services. What is the function of satellites in orbit? Satellites launched into orbit have a variety of functions and missions, depending on their size and range. However, satellites usually have 5 main functions, including telecommunications, observe the Earth, technological development, navigation and space science research. Some satellites are also used for military purposes, however, the number of these satellites is not many. Except for satellites used for navigation and navigation purposes, other tasks today are mainly performed by small satellites. For example, 80% of satellites serving telecommunications and 79% of satellites for technology research and development have a mass of less than 300 kilograms. How many countries have satellites operating in Earth orbit? According to Orbiting Now, there are currently 105 countries registered to operate satellites in Earth orbit. Among them, the 10 countries and organizations with the most satellites include 1. US, 4511. 2. China, 586. 3. UK, 561. 4. Russia, 177. 5. Japan, 90. 6. India, 62. 7. Canada, 56. 8. Germany, 48. 9. Luxembourg, 45. 10. Argentina, 38. The list of countries with the highest number of satellites today is not surprising because these are countries that have long participated in the era of space exploration. However, it is worth noting that at the beginning of the 21st century, only 14 countries launched satellites into orbit, including Vietnam with the Venusat-1 satellite launched into orbit in 2008. An additional 91 countries do this. In what orbits do satellites usually operate? Satellites often operate in many different orbits, in which each orbit has its own advantages and disadvantages. Here are some of the most common types of satellite orbits. 1. Low Earth orbit, LEO, is an orbit at an altitude of 200 to 2,000 kilometers. The advantage of satellites when operating in this orbit is that they are easy to access and control and have low launch costs, but the disadvantage is that the coverage area is small and many satellites are needed to provide services on a large scale. 2. Medium Earth orbit, MEO, is an orbit at an altitude of 2,000 to 36,000 kilometers. The advantage of satellites operating in this orbit is that they have wider coverage and require fewer satellites to provide widespread service. However, the disadvantage is that it costs more to launch satellites and is more difficult to control. Navigation satellites, such as GPS satellites, operate primarily at this altitude. 3. Geostationary orbit, GEO, is an orbit at an altitude of over 36,000 kilometers and the satellite's rotation period will be equal to the Earth's rotation period, causing the satellite to stand still in one position relative to the Earth. This makes it possible for satellites to cover a large area. The disadvantage is the high cost of launching satellites and high signal delay. 4. Tundra orbit is a special type of orbit with variable altitude, depending on each specific mission. However, the disadvantage of this orbit is that satellites have a more complicated way of operating than when launched into other orbits.